This week's event is on minimum wage policy. As a human rights organisation, FLAC believe that everyone should be entitled to a fair wage for their work. The concept of an adequate minimum wage is central to this, and it is necessary to ensure that all workers can achieve a good standard of living. Our first speaker for this event will be Paul Redmond. Paul works as a research officer at the Economic and Social Research Institute. Paul will be discussing minimum wage policy over the past 20 years in Ireland, and will also be discussing how changes in minimum wage can affect the labour market. Our second speaker will be Alan Eustace. Alan is currently pursuing a PhD on employment law and human rights. Alan will be discussing the EU Commission's recent proposal for an EU directive on adequate minimum wage. We hope you enjoy this event.
My name is Paul Redmond. I'm a researcher with the Economic and Social Research Institute. A lot of my research involves minimum wage policy, and I spend quite a lot of time trying to look at the implications of minimum wage changes in terms of the labour market. So that's going to be the focus of my talk today. What I'll do is I'll first of all give an overview of minimum wage policy in Ireland over the last 20 years or so, and then I'll go on to review the evidence on the labour market impacts of a minimum wage. I'll focus primarily on Ireland, but where it's appropriate I can bring in the other international evidence and literature to see how we compare. First of all, in terms of minimum wage policy in Ireland and where it all started, a statutory minimum wage was introduced in Ireland for the first time in April 2000 in accordance with the National Minimum Wage Act. At the time, the minimum wage was then introduced at a rate of £4.40, which is the equivalent to €5.58 per hour. And following the increase, or following the introduction of the minimum wage, you had fairly regular increases from 2000 to 2007. So almost every year there was a minimum wage increase. So that by 2007, the minimum wage rate stood at €8.65 per hour. However, then there was a long period during which the minimum wage didn't increase, and this coincided with the financial crisis and the subsequent recession that was quite severe and prolonged. And so what you had was this kind of long period from 2008 to 2015 during which the minimum wage didn't increase. There was a period during this time where it actually decreased, but this was short-lived and it was reversed after 6 months. So from 2008 to 2015, there were no increases. The policy landscape, I suppose, changed then quite significantly in 2015 with the establishment of the Low Pay Commission. And the Low Pay Commission, they consist of, of academics, representatives from trade unions and employer groups. And the goal of the aim of the Low Pay Commission is to provide yearly recommendations to the Irish government on what the minimum wage should be. So following Low Pay Commission recommendations, the minimum wage was increased from €8 to €8.65 per hour to €9.15 per hour in January 2016. So this was the first increase in a long time since 2007. Subsequent to that, there have been yearly increases recommended in 17, 18, 19, 20, and most recently in 2021. Here's a table showing giving an overview of how minimum wage rates have progressed in Ireland since its introduction. And, as I said, in 2016, it was €9.15 per hour, and there were subsequent increases. So now it stands at €10.20 per hour. That was the most recent increase, which just occurred in January 2021. It's significant to note that although when you look at individual yearly increases, for example, the most recent one, you look at that in isolation, it seems quite small because it was a 10-cent increase from €10.10 to €10.20. But when you look at the cumulative increases from 2016 to 2021, it went from €8.65 to €10.20, which is quite a big increase of about 18%. In terms of the incidence of minimum wage employment, well, we can look to our labour force survey because we're lucky in that the Low Pay Commission, along with the Central Statistics Office, they worked to get a question added to the labour force survey in Q2 of 2016, which specifically asks people whether they're on the minimum wage, which is very useful to us when it comes to researching this issue. So first of all, we see that from this takes data from 2017 to 2019, and we see that overall 8% of employees over this period were on the minimum wage. However, this incidence varies dramatically by sector. Some sectors are very important when it comes to minimum wage employment. For example, retail and accommodation and food. So if you look at the retail sector, what you see is actually 20% of employees in retail are on the minimum wage. In accommodation and food, this figure is actually 30%. So 30% of workers in accommodation and food are actually minimum wage employees. So it's these two sectors that are really the big employers of minimum wage workers in Ireland. In terms of some of the characteristics of minimum wage employees, they tend to be slightly more likely to be women. So 55%. This is from 2019 of minimum wage workers were women compared to 45% being men. This can actually vary year on year and even quarter on quarter. And in some cases, it's actually a bit closer than this. And we're actually doing some work at the moment where we're looking at minimum wages in a comparative perspective across Europe and comparing it to Ireland. I'm using a different data set, but what we see is actually in Ireland, the gender split with minimum wage workers is quite narrow. It's roughly equal, slightly more men on the minimum wage than women, but roughly equal compared to some other countries where that gender split is much more pronounced. Like in some European countries, far more women are on the minimum wage than men. So in terms of age, half of all minimum wage employees are aged 15 to 24 years old. So minimum wage employees are far more likely to be young workers. They're also far more likely to be part-time workers or working fewer hours. So 60% of minimum wage employees work part-time compared to 20% of employees overall. So minimum wage employees, they're slightly more likely to be women, they tend to be young, and they tend to be more likely to be part-time employees. In terms of the evidence on the impact of the minimum wage, I should say that we've done a lot of work on this recently in the ESRI, and actually our work is funded by the Low Pay Commission. So there's a joint ESRI and Low Pay Commission research program which has been ongoing now for about 5 years, which has allowed us to produce some of this evidence that feeds into the policy debate. But one of the biggest questions when it comes to minimum wage policy is, if you increase the minimum wage, will this lead to negative labour market outcomes for minimum wage workers? If the minimum wage goes up, will these minimum wage workers lose their jobs, or will their hours be cut? Now, this is the focus of a lot of debate and work in terms of the minimum wage literature, and the evidence is mixed. There are papers out there that show reduced employment or hours associated with minimum wage increases. There are papers that show no employment effects associated with minimum wage increases. So it's hard to be conclusive and say whether or not a minimum wage increase has negative effects on employment outcomes. However, there are some studies that attempt to gather together all of the available evidence and to try and draw out what the main findings are. For example, Dubay, a couple of years ago, conducted a survey of the literature for the UK government and concluded that the evidence shows little or perhaps muted effects of minimum wages on employment. However, he did caution that if governments are thinking about pursuing more ambitious minimum wage increases, that does call for some caution, because we don't really know enough about very, very large minimum wage increases and the effects on the labour market. In terms of the Irish evidence, so we've done some work on this, and particularly on the 2016 minimum wage increase, and we found that this increase, there was no evidence of job losses associated with the 2016 minimum wage increase. So we didn't find evidence that minimum wage workers actually lost their jobs. However, we did find evidence of a reduction in hours. In particular, this was focused really on minimum wage workers on temporary contracts. Their hours reduced by between 2 and 3 hours per week, so it was pretty significant. There's earlier work that showed that the introduction of the minimum wage in 2000 had little impact on employment. So generally speaking, while there are papers out there that show minimum wages can have negative effect on both the number of jobs and hours, by and large, the effects tend to be quite small. However, as I've said, we have found evidence for Ireland that, especially when you focus on workers on temporary contracts, the effect on hours can be actually fairly large. So another big question when it comes to the minimum wage relates to wage inequality. So if you increase the minimum wage, will this have an impact on wage inequality? So I have a paper with colleagues Karina Durley and Seamus McGuinness in just last year where we look at this. And what we find is that the 2016 minimum wage increase was associated with a reduction in wage inequality. Measured by the P90, P10 ratio, it decreased by 8%. So what that ratio measures is it looks at people in the 90th percentile of the wage distribution, the really high earners, compares it to the wages in the 10th percentile of the wage distribution, the low earners. And it showed that when you increase the minimum wage, it narrows this gap, so it reduces wage inequality. We also found evidence that there were wage spillovers to people earning more than the minimum wage. So this might be, for example, because if low-paid workers get a pay rise, the people earning above that wage might also want a pay rise, because what matters is your relative standing in the wage distribution. When it comes to poverty and income inequality, it's not as clear-cut. So we've done some work profiling minimum wage workers, again with colleagues from the ESRI, and we found that 17% of minimum wage employees were at risk of poverty. This is higher than non-minimum wage employees of just 3.3%. But the key point here is that while 17% are at risk of poverty, this still means that the overall vast majority, like 83%, aren't at risk of poverty. In that regard, the minimum wage may be a blunt tool for tackling poverty. Perhaps to tackle poverty, you need to address actually getting people into work and jobless households, that type of thing. Again, my work with my ESRI colleagues in 2020, we showed limited impact on household income inequality. Now, this may initially sound like a contradiction, because a minute ago I said wage inequality reduced, but now I'm saying the impact on household income inequality is very, very muted. And sometimes the example I give to try and reconcile this apparent contradiction is, consider a young person who's working part-time on the minimum wage, but living with two parents who are quite well paid. When the minimum wage goes up, that young person will feel the effect of that. Their hourly wage goes up. Okay, so in that way, minimum wages affect the wage distribution. But in terms of that increase, and in terms of the contribution of that increase on household income, it's really very, very small. So in terms of the impact on household income inequality, it's quite small and in some regards non-existent. We found a limited impact on household income inequality, but it was very limited. And again, this goes to the point that minimum wage workers, they're not all concentrated in low-income households, but they tend to be spread right across the household income distribution. And they're oftentimes, more often than not, secondary earners in the household. We've also done some work on labour market transitions, and what we find is that minimum wage workers are more likely to transition to higher pay than actually stay in minimum wage employment. So it tends to be a stepping stone to higher pay. That being said, minimum wage employees are also more likely to transition to unemployment or inactivity. Finally, we've tried to do some work on minimum wage compliance, and as I'm sure you can appreciate, this is very difficult to quantify by its very nature, compliance or non-compliance. But our best guess is that 5.6% of minimum wage workers are paid below the minimum wage for reasons other than those permitted under legislation. Let me finish by briefly discussing the implications of the recent pandemic and COVID crisis. As we all know, there's been widespread business closures in retail, accommodation and food. And as I've shown, these are really important sectors when it comes to minimum wage employment. So they employ more than half of all minimum wage employees in Ireland. So low-paid and minimum wage workers, in fact, are disproportionately impacted by these job losses. In terms of conclusions and policy implications, well, to conclude, as I said, about 8% of employees in Ireland are on the minimum wage. Half are in the retail, accommodation and food sectors, which are facing significant challenges due to the COVID crisis. Hopefully during this year, as the pandemic gets under control with vaccines and so on, minimum wage employees may return to work quite quickly. However, there could be long-term disruption for others, particularly those that rely on tourism, for example, in the hotel and restaurant sectors. Going forward, recent communications from the government indicate that they tend to be they're committed to a living wage. The implementation of a living wage would see quite a big increase from the current minimum wage rate. While we've seen that the existing evidence shows little to no effects in terms of employment, in terms of job losses, albeit with some negative hours effects in Ireland for especially for those in temporary contract workers, we need to take careful consideration when making these decisions, because, again, as Dubé said in that review of literature for the UK government, while the effects are muted in general, we don't really know enough about really large minimum wage increases, so we have to be quite cautious in that regard. So these are all issues that need to be considered by Local Pay Commission and policymakers in the coming months. So that concludes my talk. For anybody that wants more information, you can go to the ESRI website to view all of the papers that I've mentioned here.
Thank you to FLAC for hosting this event and to Ciara for inviting me. My name is Eustace. I'm a PhD candidate in the law school, researching employment law and human rights. As a proud Trinity FLAC alumnus myself, I'm glad to see the society still going strong during these socially distant times. I'm also glad to see more engagement between FLAC and the postgrad community here. I also want to take this opportunity to thank those of my PhD colleagues who gave feedback on an earlier version of this presentation and helped shape my comments today. I will be talking about the new European Commission proposal for an EU directive on an adequate minimum wage. First, I will discuss the economic and political context in which this proposal has emerged. I will briefly talk about the legal basis for the directive, then examine the substance of the directive itself. I will look at 3 lines of criticism of this proposal that have developed since its publication. Overall, my view is this is a welcome and quite ambitious proposal. In fact, its ambition is one reason why it is, unfortunately, unlikely to be enacted in the proposed form. However, the proposal certainly reflects and will drive further change in the economic focus and political dynamics of the European institutions towards a more explicitly social vision for the Union. This proposal was initially floated by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in her State of the Union address back in September, and it was published at the end of October. Nicolas Schmit, the Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, said at an event in November the number one rationale for pushing this directive is actually the simple fact that President von der Leyen promised it, to show that the Union can deliver on commitments to citizens and member states. But more practical motivations, which you can see from the recitals in the text of the proposed directive itself, are to address 2 problems the Commission has identified within the internal market of the EU. On the one hand, there's a rate of in-work poverty, and on the other, a wide divergence in wage rates across the member states. We can easily see why the first of those is a bad thing. But let's focus on the latter problem just for a moment. The Commission has acknowledged that divergence in wage rates between member states leads to what they call social dumping, whereby businesses rely on cheaper labour from, in particular, Eastern or post-2004 expansion member states to undercut higher wages in Western member states. In that respect, we should view this proposed directive in the context of a recent series of reforms to the Posted Workers Directive, which saw increased protections for workers who travelled from those lower wage member states to work in higher wage member states, and gave the higher wage member states more power to enforce local labour laws. It should also be viewed in the context of the Pillar of Social Rights adopted by the EU in 2017, and the pledge by the Portuguese government to pursue social policy goals during its current presidency of the Council. So I think we can tentatively say this proposal is part of a concerted effort emerging under the von der Leyen Commission to deliver on the famous social Europe we have been promised since at least the Delors Commission. At a time of fragility for the Union, although, to be fair, when has the EU not been described as fragile, we can probably expect lots of measures in the fields of social and environmental policy from the von der Leyen Commission to win hearts and minds across the continent. And these will be particularly important in the context of rebuilding the European economy after the COVID-19 pandemic. I think, to be fair, even the Commission will own up to the failures of Union institutions during the last financial crisis, in particular the Commission's push for austerity in several member states, which undoubtedly saw an erosion of workers' rights and standards of living in a relentless push for competitiveness. Now, of course, admitting to the mistakes of its predecessor is relatively painless for a new Commission, but I think it's still a big deal for there to be a clear rhetorical and ideological break from the Barroso and Juncker Commissions to the von der Leyen Commission. most commentators seem to agree this directive is also an effort to bolster the EU's legitimacy in the eyes of citizens. And might I cheekily suggest that this is exactly the kind of directive that our friends across the water would definitely have tried to block. So the Commission is probably taking advantage of Brexit to reshape the economy of the internal market and the political priorities of the Union along more continental lines. So with that context in mind, let's look at what this proposed directive actually involves. First off, it might come as a surprise and something of a disappointment to those of you who are watching an event on the minimum wage to learn that this proposed directive does not actually establish an EU minimum wage. Before I talk about what the directive does, it's worth looking quickly at why it doesn't, unlike Ronseal, do exactly what it says on the tin. I won't bore you too much with the intricacies of union competence under the TFEU, but briefly you will all be aware that the union operates on the principle of conferral. That is, it only has the powers or competences that the member states have specifically given it in the treaties. The minimum wage directive is proposed in accordance with Article 153 TFEU, which gives the union supporting and complementary competence to regulate working conditions and the representation of workers. So, the real power in this area still lies with the member states. Moreover, Article 153 subsection 5 TFEU specifically precludes the regulation of pay by the union. Without going into the case law, it's a bit more flexible than that, but the important thing to remember is that everyone agrees the EU does not have the competence to actually set minimum wage rates within the member states. The Commission reckons it has found a workaround to this prohibition in Article 1535, which is reflected in the approach it has taken in this directive, but that does remain to be seen. So, if the directive does not set a minimum wage rate, what does it do? There are actually two parts to this directive that are relatively distinct. The first part aims to increase collective bargaining coverage within member states, but I won't get into that because this event is specifically on the minimum wage. The main part of the proposed directive requires member states to adopt mechanisms for fixing a minimum wage that will be adequate, taking into account a number of specified factors. In the associated documentation and the recitals, the Commission suggests a benchmark of 60% of the median wage and 50% of the mean wage as an adequate minimum wage, which, incidentally, Ireland would not satisfy as things stand. So the Union is not setting a minimum wage, it is requiring the member states to set a minimum wage in a particular way. It would oblige member states to establish consultative bodies to set adequate minimum wages and publish fixed criteria for assessing the minimum wage, which must include the purchasing power of minimum wages, taking into account the cost of living, the general level of gross wages and their distribution, the growth rate of gross wages, and labour productivity developments. I said that the member states are obliged to establish consultative bodies. Ireland already has a low pay commission, which was established in 2015 to advise the government and publish research. Under this directive, that commission would get extra powers and a more defined mandate in line with those 4 criteria for adequacy of the minimum wage. Now that all sounds pretty great. Research from the Commission suggests only 4 member states have high enough minimum wages to be considered adequate under the model set out in this directive. I think France is the best performer on that metric. So clearly this directive would lead to wage increases across most of the Union. However, in the commentary that has followed this proposal, a number of flaws have been identified. Some have accused the Commission of a lack of ambition, of taking too timid an approach to competence, and shying away from more robust measures to raise minimum wages. I think this criticism is mostly unfair. Article 153 subsection 5 is strict, and already I think you'd get pretty decent odds on the directive as it is currently formulated being struck down by the Court of Justice for violating the principle of confer. There's also a strong possibility of this proposal getting a yellow card from national parliaments under the subsidiarity protocol for excessive interference in member state powers. Now, it should be borne in mind that the Commission did push for a framework agreement between the social partners, so trade unions and business representatives, on minimum wages and collective bargaining, which would have allowed this proposal to do more. But business representatives were, unsurprisingly, flat out opposed to such an agreement and indeed remain opposed to this directive, whereas trade unions are broadly supportive. Now, there is, as is often the case with EU social law, a concern about the effectiveness of enforcement of this directive. It does not seem likely that the final directive will be capable of having direct effect, and enforcement of minimum wage laws will remain in the hands of national authorities. However, just with the recent reforms to the Posted Workers Directive, the proposal does contain some provisions that oblige member states to strengthen their national labour law enforcement systems, which is always a positive, even if the substance of the directive doesn't end up affecting much change within the labour market dynamics. I think the most legitimate criticism, though, is that this directive might actually miss the mark. If one of its goals is to reduce in-work poverty, there is a substantial risk that this directive will not have the impact the Commission hopes. This is because it focuses on hourly wage rates, whereas we know that the working poor are often substantially underemployed, in the sense that they work in casual jobs with not enough hours to provide for their living costs, even at a higher hourly rate. So to truly make work pay, you would need to set adequate minimum incomes, not just minimum wage rates. Or you'd need minimum wage rates accompanied by minimum hours guarantees. We're good at regulating maximum working time, and in fact there are EU directives on that very subject, but not minimum hours, which poses particular issues in respect of the gig economy and so-called 0 hours contracts. But this is a criticism that applies to many national minimum wage systems already and to existing EU legislation on working time. It would have been interesting to see the Commission propose changes to the Working Time Directive to oblige employers to offer minimum hours or at least more stability in hours. A simple minimum income law would, I think, have been far too ambitious a goal and outside EU competence. But we know the Union has competence over working time because we already have a very well established Working Time Directive. As it stands, I think it's likely this proposal will face significant pushback from national parliaments and member state representatives in the Council. The European Parliament will probably be supportive, but already national governments in some member states have signalled opposition. I won't be giving any prizes for guessing which ones. Their fear, not unfounded, I think, is that these sorts of interventions in the labour market will remove the competitive advantages of their economies and workers over more high-cost, high-wage member states in the West and particularly Northwest. And so I think similar concerns motivate the same government's current legal challenges to those Posted Workers Directive reforms that I mentioned earlier. So even if this proposed directive makes it into law, there will almost certainly be a question to be answered by the Court of Justice as to whether it respects the boundaries of union competence. I hope that is answered in the affirmative. Our trade union representatives and many national governments were reportedly pleasantly surprised by this sophisticated proposal. Now, it's likely that the proposal will face a 2-year legislative process and probably a 2-year implementation period thereafter. But if we manage to have this directive in force across the Union by the end of the von der Leyen Commission, I think that will be a significant positive contribution to the internal market and to the vision of social Europe. It's vital that European governments and EU institutions do not respond to the current economic crisis by making the same mistakes made after the last one. The rebuilding of the European economy, which will begin once vaccinations are rolled out and lockdowns eased across the continent, fingers crossed that will be sooner rather than later, must focus on growth in wages and standards of living, not just growth in GDP. If there is to be further economic integration within the EU, it must avoid the perils of social dumping, and its benefits must be directed towards workers, not just business interests. I think proposals like this show that the von der Leyen Commission is taking that challenge seriously. Thank you all very much for listening, and thanks again to FLAC for an excellent discussion.